People spend a lot of time worrying about shark attacks, but statistically, you are much more likely to be crushed to death by a tipping vending machine. Our brains are incredibly bad at assessing real-world risk. We like to think of ourselves as rational actors, especially with money on the line. But in 1974, psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman published a paper that proved human beings do not operate like logical computers. They discovered that when we face a complex probability problem, we don't actually do the math. Instead, we use mental shortcuts. Think about how you judge the distance of a mountain. You don't calculate the miles, you rely on a shortcut based on clarity. The sharper the mountain looks, the closer you assume it is. Most of the time, that shortcut works. But if you try to use it on a foggy day, the poor visibility tricks your brain. You will confidently assume the mountain is much further away than it actually is, making a severe, systematic error. The business world is full of fog, and the exact same mental shortcuts that distort our physical vision also distort how we calculate financial risk. When we rely on intuition to make decisions, we fall into a set of predictable traps. The first trap is what Tversky and Kahneman called representativeness. To understand it, consider a man named Steve. Steve is very shy, highly withdrawn, invariably helpful, and he has a deep passion for detail and structure. Based on that profile, is Steve more likely to be a farmer or a librarian? If you ask an average group of people, human intuition overwhelmingly points to the librarian. It feels like an obvious match. But look at this population graphic. It shows the true statistical reality. There is a massive grid of farmers in the actual workforce, dwarfing a very tiny handful of librarians. Any reasonable estimate of probability has to factor in that massive base rate advantage. Yet the brain actively ignores that massive statistical disparity. Because Steve's personality perfectly matches our internal stereotype of a librarian, we substitute the hard math for a simple judgment of similarity. Now map that exact flaw onto the modern startup ecosystem. Investors are constantly searching for the next big thing, and they rely heavily on their gut feelings to find it. When a charismatic young college dropout pitches an app, they perfectly match the cultural stereotype of a successful tech mogul. Investors see the traits they expect to see, completely ignoring the base rate reality that roughly 90% of all startups fail. Investing based on how well a founder matches a stereotype, rather than their statistical probability of success, ignores the underlying math in favor of a comforting narrative, leaving you to bet on a success story that is statistically unlikely to repeat. The second trap relies on our memory. If you take a random English text, are there more words that start with the letter R, or more words where R is the third letter? Most people guess that words starting with R are more common. The truth is the opposite. But it's incredibly easy for your brain to retrieve words like road or run from memory, while searching for words with R in the third position takes actual mental effort. This is the availability heuristic. We systematically confuse the ease of recalling an event with the actual frequency of it happening in the real world.
If a memory is vivid and easy to access, we assume the event is highly probable. This plays out on trading floors every day. A highly publicized, vivid stock crash dominates the news cycle and burns into our memory. Because the image of losing everything is so easy to recall, traders develop an outsized fear of total economic collapse, even when the broad market data shows stability. You see the exact same thing in sports betting. When a massive underdog pulls off a shocking upset in a major cricket tournament, that vivid memory skews future bets. Punters start placing irrational wagers on unlikely outcomes simply because the memory of the last upset is so fresh. The availability trap forces us to prioritize vivid, emotional memories over boring, reliable data, and that leads directly to panic selling and disastrous financial bets. The final trap is about where we start our calculations. In a classic experiment, Kahneman and Tversky gave two groups of high school students 5 seconds to guess the answer to a math problem. This split-screen diagram reveals the setup. One group saw an ascending sequence starting with 1. Their median guess was 512. The other group saw a descending sequence starting with 8. Their median guess was over 2,000. The actual answer for both is 40,320.
We call this anchoring. Because the students didn't have time to do the full calculation, their brains got stuck on the very first number they saw. They tried to estimate the rest, but they made totally insufficient adjustments from that initial starting point. This psychological glitch dictates the reality of high-stakes venture capital negotiations. Think about the pitches you see on Shark Tank. When an entrepreneur confidently asks for a massive, sometimes completely arbitrary valuation right out of the gate, they are planting an anchor. Even if the investors push back and negotiate the price down, the final agreed-upon valuation stays artificially tethered to that initial high number. Whoever establishes the first number in a business deal effectively hacks the subconscious math of everyone else in the room. This raises a pivotal question. If these mental traps are so common, why doesn't lifelong business experience teach us to avoid them? The researchers realized that everyday life doesn't naturally organize information into neat statistical categories. We don't keep a running tally of exactly how often our predictions come true versus how often they fail, which prevents us from ever developing a genuine intuition for real math. As a result, the internal sensation of having a strong gut feeling is completely decoupled from whether a decision is actually correct. Confidence is just a feeling. It is not a metric of accuracy. Consider the gambler's fallacy. If you watch a coin land on tails 5 times in a row, your gut strongly tells you heads is due on the next flip. You feel completely confident, even though the coin has no memory and the odds remain exactly 50-50. Surviving in high-stakes environments requires a difficult admission. You have to acknowledge that your brain is a flawed calculating machine, ignore the comfort of your intuition, and actively build data-driven systems to enforce reality. Because if you rely on your gut, you're just guessing in the fog.